What's their, what's the big
Yeah,
one?
yeah.
I'm looking at
I mean, it's just like. I think like the client
thank you for coming. We are happy to have Professor Matt Garcia
trying to prove. But we know this.
presenting on the history of intuitionism in mathematics. So everyone, thank Professor Garcia for coming, and I guess the show is yours.
Okay. Right. So we're going to discuss the history of intuitionism in mathematics, which, if there's any clue by the title, there's not going to be a ton of mathematics in this talk. Okay, it's just sprinkled in here and there. And another surprising thing, which you can't tell from the title, is actually more than half the talk has no intuitionism in it whatsoever. So let's just get started. Here's a quick outline of what we're going to talk about. What is intuitionism even, right? And I wouldn't fault you for not knowing this because of, well, you'll see how these historical events that we're going to trace unfolded in a way that conspire that you necessarily don't know what intuitionism is. Then we'll hit some key figures in the history or prehistory of intuitionism. Gottlob Frege, who introduced quantified variables before his time in logic. Things were very ambiguous. There was no way to, no symbolic formal way to indicate when a statement was universally or existentially quantified. So that's basically due just to Frege. Then we'll talk about a character you've probably heard more about before, George Cantor, who shocked the mathematical world by proving that there's more than one size of infinity. Okay, and after doing that, dedicated the rest of his life to set theory, kind of laid all the foundations there. Then we hit the turn of the 20th century, where this whole issue of where the foundations of mathematics actually lie, or what the best system to spell out the foundations of mathematics actually comes to a head. This notion of intuitionism versus what we call formalism, or more commonly today, classical mathematics. And the way it's painted, for good reason, is actually that this is like a personal dispute between Brouwer and David Hilbert. We'll talk quite a lot about. So then what happens afterward? Well, nothing satisfying. That's the spoiler here. Hiding in Kolmogorov, Hiding was a student of Brouwer's, and Kolmogorov just came out of nowhere and kind of settled a lot of questions about the difference between these potential foundations of mathematics. Okay, and then we'll finish up. So in preparing this talk, I realized that I might go way over time. So intuitionism today is just a list of 3 things that I think are kind of related, that I could actually give you a whole second talk on the modern history of intuitionism, but maybe we'll save that for a future term. Okay, so first let's talk about, yes.
So weird question, but would you prefer us saving all the questions towards the end, or would you rather, like, after a slide, clarify?
I would say a mix. Okay. So if there's something that's really compelling, feel free. And if I think that I can't answer it concisely, or if I want to buy myself more time, I'll push it to the end. Okay, so what is intuitionism? It's kind of a philosophical perspective more than anything before a certain time in history. It posits that there's no objective reality in mathematics specifically. So that is to say, everything that is true is subjective and depends on constructive mental activity. That is, it relies necessarily on the creations that a mathematician has made rather than the discovery of some objective reality. So one major part of this is that the interpretation of the negation of a statement in an intuitionistic framework is much weaker than in classical logic, to say the negation of P means that P is refutable, not that it's false. Okay, that is just to say, this is again reflective of the subjective nature of truth that is assumed in the philosophy of intuitionism. Okay, so the assertion that a certain object exists with a given set of properties for an intuitionist is the same as saying that you can construct an object, that you can actually create the thing that satisfies those properties. Okay? An intuitionist, most importantly, rejects that you cannot prove something exists by refuting its non-existence. Okay, that's seems like I'm not really saying much here, but once we get to the symbolic part of this, which is admittedly quite a bit down the road, maybe we'll have a more clarity here. I'll give you some symbols now, though. This means that P, some assertion in an intuitionistic framework, is stronger than the assertion of negation P, the refutation of P being refutable. Namely, in classical mathematics, we all learned this in the introduction to mathematical reasoning, the double negation is the same as the original statement, right? Not so in an intuitionistic framework, okay? So again, this is very fluffy, right? This is all philosophical, but when it comes down to it, it turns out that you can write down a formalization of this system of logic. In fact, there are many, many models of this system of logic that all have unique consequences that you can derive from, okay? So just some consequences of this simple observation that stems from the philosophical definition of intuitionism. This eliminates the law of the excluded middle from intuitionistic reasoning, right? Having not proved or disproved an assertion P, the intuitionist will not accept as a tautology P or negation P, right? Again, this is a fundamental thing that we use in proofs in our everyday lives all the time, right? Not a valid rule of inference in any model of intuitionism. Okay, so here's another thing that we lose. An intuitionist will accept that P and not the negation of P, sorry, cannot be true. The law of non-contradiction. So therefore, we lose De Morgan's laws as well in intuitionistic logic. Okay, so it feels like we're throwing a lot away here of what we work with day by day. Yeah.
We also lose proof by contradiction.
Yes. Yeah, it's a lot.
About half of computer science just went up.
Half of computer science went out the window, but another half of computer science that has emerged in the past, say, 3 or 4 decades comes into the window. Okay, good. I'm glad you brought that up. So here's a dialogue. Let's see the classical mathematician and I, an intuitionist. So C comes along and says, I have proved A disjunction B. The intuitionist says, good. Which one did you prove? Classical mathematician. What do you mean? I don't know what you mean. Well, you said you proved A or B. Which one did you prove? Neither. I assumed not A and not B and derived a contradiction. Oh, I see. You proved not A and not B. That's right. That's another way of saying the same thing. Not so. Okay. Well, I shouldn't say not so. That's the intuitionist in me coming out. That depends on the perspective, right? To the classical mathematician, the valid deduction, the intuitionist says there is a faulty premise in deducing A or B. What you really prove is not A and not B. Okay, so that's kind of flavor of what Brouwer and Hilbert will eventually be arguing about a few decades or many decades down the line here. Okay, so this is due to Ed Nelson in this book, Mathematical Mythologies, which is kind of fun. By the way, I've been quite laissez-faire with the citations here. They're just kind of sprinkled in throughout the slides, but I think they'll be distributed, right? I don't think anybody's gonna prosecute me. Okay, so let's talk about some of our key figures. First and foremost, Frege. So speaking of citations, I ripped all these images off Wikipedia. Okay, quick bio. Born November 8th, 1884, in the German Confederation. Educated first at the University of Jena, then on to Göttingen, where he attained his doctorate, and then he had a lot of works on logic and arithmetic, and among them, his first was the, I've tried to pronounce this in my head a bunch of times, Begriffsschrift. Begriffsschrift, the Begriffsschrift of 1879. What it did was laid out a formal system of logic based on arithmetic. Okay, so this is actually, as we'll shortly see, the first step in trying to derive mathematics from logic, or that is to say, to express the valid statements or be able to validate or falsify any statement that could be made in mathematics strictly via logic or the symbolic manipulation of some agreed upon language, which prior to this, logic and mathematics were viewed as largely separate. And I think it's a much more fuzzy question for us today, right? They're definitely more closely intertwined in our minds now. So here's what Frege was able to do with his axiomatic predicate logic. And when I say predicate logic, I mean, of course, logic containing quantifiers. He was able to solve the standing problem in logic, the problem of multiple generalities. So in traditional logic at the time, if I say the sentence, some cat is feared by all mice, could mean at least two different things. And Frege's quantifiers allow us to distinguish these at least two possible different readings. So here are the readings, paraphrase. We could be saying every mouse fears some cat, or we could be saying there is a cat which is feared by all mice. Okay, and so I want to emphasize that in the traditional logic of the day, this original sentence, some cat is feared by every mouse, was admissible as something that was studied in logic. Okay, despite the ambiguity present here. Okay, so let's see how we would express this using quantifiers. This is something that you could derive yourself, right? This is exactly what is common to us today, what was groundbreaking in 1879 or 4, I forget the year. Right, so we're all M such that M is a mouse implies that there exists a C such that C is a cat, and M fears C is our first statement. As opposed to our second statement, that there is a specific cat, there exists a C that is a cat, and for all M such that M is a mouse implies the mouse fears the cat. That specific cat that we specified at the beginning by the quantifier, the existential quantifier. Okay, so this is a major advance in logic. For this, to this day, nearly universally, pun intended. So the goal of this axiomatization was to eliminate the need for intuition when reasoning about arithmetic, thereby construing arithmetic as a sub-discipline of logic, right? That is to say, I mean, just the language that I chose to use here, this is very anti-intuitionist, right? There should be nothing that the mathematician does that relies on internal constructions, okay? So this view is known as logicism, or really it's the precursor to what we have vaguely referred to as formalism so far, or the classical mathematics that we do, whatever that means, today. Okay, so on to Cantor. Quick bio of him. By the way, this is him as a young person. Born March 3rd, 1845 in the Russian Empire. Educated at the Swiss Federal Polytechnic and then the University of Berlin. Did his thesis on number theory and trigonometry, which I find really interesting. When you learn about Cantor, or like whenever you pull any information out about him from the ether, it's always about set theory, right? But he was a passionate number theorist and very interested in trigonometry in his education. And his thesis was this paper called On a Property of the Collections of All Real Algebraic Numbers. So it turns out that the set of all real algebraic numbers is countable. And also in this thesis, he illustrated that the set of all transcendental numbers, i.e. those real numbers which are the solution to no polynomial with real coefficients, are uncountable, thereby providing the gateway to show that there is no bijection between the natural numbers and the real numbers, right? Because the transcendental numbers are a sub-collection of the real numbers, which do not admit a bijection to the natural numbers. Okay, so that's roughly how the proof goes there. Anybody remember or happen to know the argument that he used to, yeah, the diagonalization argument came out in 1891, closer to 20 years after this. He actually used a much more machinery heavy way of proving this by taking an arbitrary sequence of real numbers and constructing a collection of nested intervals and showing that those nested intervals necessarily contain some real number which was not in the sequence to begin with, which I find fascinating. But yeah, diagonalization is the thing to remember. I didn't know this until I was preparing this talk, so I thought that was a fun tidbit to share. Right, but the diagonalization is the pinnacle. That's the nice thing that he eventually did. It took 17 years to get there. Or sorry, more than that. Right, so, right, before Cantor, it was implicitly assumed that all infinities had the same size, or they were equinumerous, right? And then we just outlined why the thesis kind of illustrated that this isn't the case when you consider the natural numbers and the transcendental numbers, or even all the real numbers. So Cantor, for the next 2 decades, this is why he's remembered for set theory, because he devoted his entire career pretty much to set theoretical concerns, namely proving, quote unquote, that if A is a subset of B and B is a subset of A, then we have the sets A and B are equal. Right? This is something we really take for granted day by day. And it took him a really long time to prove it. Why do I have it in quotation marks? Because he didn't succeed, actually. There was a flaw in the proof. It wasn't actually proven until 1898 in Bernstein's thesis. Right? This is why sometimes this is called the Schroeder-Cantor-Bernstein theorem, because Ernst Schroeder claimed to have proved it several years before Cantor did, and they were both wrong. But they still get their names on it anyway. Okay, another notable thing that Cantor did was formulate the so-called continuum hypothesis, that there are no infinities of size strictly between the size of the natural numbers and the size of the real numbers, right? So we just made an outline of the argument why the real numbers are not equinumerous with the natural numbers. But that still leaves open the question of what kinds of infinity might lie in between these two types of infinity. And Cantor hypothesized that there were no such types of infinity. And his inability to prove it really got to him. I mean, this is something that haunted him for the rest of his life, which is really sad for reasons that we'll discuss a little bit later. But in the meantime, add to the fact that there was a growing contingency of mathematicians that were much more vocal about their opposition to Cantor's work on infinite sets, namely by the likes of Leopold Kronecker, who only accepted constructions based on the natural numbers, a certain type of intuitionist, you might say, or pre-intuitionist, even a stricter kind, because only allowing the natural numbers at the outset, and certain religious types. I kind of got a kick out of this too. The fact that Cantor asserted that there was multiple cardinalities of infinity was by certain church types regarded as a challenge to the singular infinity of God, which, you know, that's enough to drive anybody crazy. So for these reasons and more, Cantor was really troubled later in his life. You know, he had this failing hypothesis. People were really attacking him a lot. He ended up becoming very, what's the word? Unpleasant to collaborate with. Yeah, and it's actually hypothesized that he might have had bipolar disorder, is what a lot of his biographers and historians of modern day say. So it's unfortunately kind of thematic to mathematicians who work on foundations. And it started a long time ago too. So I include this picture of him in his later life because on his Wikipedia page, he's one of the only mathematicians that has a before and after. Okay, so now we take our turn into the 20th century. David Hilbert. There's a bunch of pictures of Hilbert on his Wikipedia page, but everybody always uses this one, so I thought I'd follow suit. The great hat. Right, so quick biography. Born January 23rd, 1862 in Prussia. Attended the University of Königsberg, and he was well known, many branches of mathematics, algebra, geometry, lots of physics, and the main champion of formalism, something that really came in its own in the 20th century, and an inventor of the problem set, right? So anytime that you felt bad about homework, it's really Hilbert's fault. So what exactly do I mean by this? Back in 1900, at the International Congress of Mathematics in Paris, Hilbert came up with this list of 23 unsolved problems that if mathematicians could get it together and provide sound solutions to all these problems. His assertion was that he could, or the community at large, could come up with some formal foundation on which all of the rest of mathematics could be derived, right? Again, the same type of thing that Frege was after. Some axiomatic description of what is possible to derive within the realm of mathematics altogether. And this is, he was emboldened to do this because the previous year, he had reformulated Euclid's geometry to a new set of axioms because there was this controversy at the end of the 19th century about Euclid's fifth axiom, right? You may have heard of this, and I thought it took us a little bit far afield to talk about it a lot, but he came up with some kind of proposed solution to the problem with Euclid's fifth axiom. And so he's like, well, let's just do it for all mathematics, why not? Okay, so right, this is the birth of the formalist school, right? Again, just coming up with a common set of symbols and rules for how we manipulate them to validate or falsify any mathematical claim. What a dream. Okay, so in particular, this is, and I bring this up because it's kind of a sticking point for the future, for the consequential arguments that happen based on these schools emerging, formalism and intuitionism. Right, so with the right amount of care, we can combine Frege's work and universally and existentially quantify over these arbitrarily sized, an infinite set of arbitrary cardinality. Was the thought of formalism, and in particular, Hilbert proposed some solution to this problem, which we'll talk about in just a short while. So, right, formalism. Again, as we talked about with Frege, direct opposition to intuitionism, right? The idea is that we should not have to rely on anything within inside ourselves. Right, thereby circumventing this thing that makes everybody uncomfortable, that truth is subjective, right? If we can find these this axiomatization, we can solve these 23 problems, if you're a real optimist, then we can insist that truth for a mathematical statement is objective, and that it can be assigned exactly one of two values, true or false. Okay. So there is some common ground though, right, which we already kind of mentioned. All schools of thought, this is the armistice in this war, all schools of thought agreed that it was not exactly clear how to integrate Frege's work with Cantor's. So this is what Hilbert took up. Of course, I should say, it's easy to be on the side of the formalists here. Number one, because that's how we're trained when we begin to study mathematics. Number two, if you look back at the history, for most all the time, intuitionists have not provided any type of solution. They're just like, I don't believe that. But that changes a little bit later, but for now, I could see why nobody really cares for them. Okay, so to the end of trying to clarify this issue of how to, we'll address universal quantification here. This is an example that Hilbert wrote in a 1923 paper. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce the German. He introduced this new symbol tau, which was subject to this axiom. Don't worry, I'll explain this quite a bit. This is very, it's a short thing, but it's extremely dense. So here's the example that he gave to elucidate this concept of tau. So we'll take A to be the predicate, to be corruptible. Then we interpret this entire string, tau sub x of A, to be a person of such integrity that if they were corruptible, all people would be corruptible. Okay, then we define this new term, this new formula, A of tau sub x of A, to be equivalent to what we usually write as universal quantification. Now, what we do then is any deduction we make using this, this symbol, tau sub x of A, and this axiom here, we have to go back after we say, okay, this is equivalent to for all x such that A. We have to go back and see if we can eliminate tau using that axiom from the last slide for any result that quantifies only over finite sets. Okay, so this is a key argument of formalism, right? Is that if we introduce this symbol, we can in fact do manipulations without actually determining what it means to quantify over an infinite set. And then if we can eliminate it in the case of a finite set, then we know the deduction is valid altogether. That's the assertion. Okay, I want to be clear here. Hilbert didn't prove anything. He just said this is an idea for how we might do this. Okay, so kind of bold. But if you just want to get a better handle on this, really what this this string is here, this tau sub x of A, is you can think of this as a witness to the predicate A, right? It's saying, suppose there is some thing that actually, some variable thing that actually satisfies our predicate A. And then you proceed to use the formal rules to manipulate the symbols. And then if you can eliminate tau, then in fact, you have a valid quantification, is the claim. All right, there's a lot of details I'm omitting here. Number one, because I don't know them. And number two, I don't think they're written down anywhere. Okay. So, really interesting historical figure here. Kurt Gödel. Didn't mention him before in the outline, but I wanted it to be a surprise. So he was born April 28th in 1906 in Austria-Hungary and educated at the University of Vienna. And he was best known for his incompleteness theorems, which at the time dealt a crushing blow to the philosophy of formalism, right? Namely, said that the most powerfully stated goal of formalism is necessarily unattainable. Okay, so let's elaborate on that a little bit. So, sorry, I just got to the point where I wrote some additional things I wanted to say, and I forgot to say a few of them. That's okay, we'll just skip them. So, 1931, Gödel submitted a paper on formally undecidable propositions of Principia Mathematica and related systems. Okay, so I was talking about this with Sam right before the talk. Principia Mathematica is another work by Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead, published in 3 volumes between 1910 and 1913, whose goal was to provide not only formal, but an actual symbolic foundation for mathematics. That is, they wanted to write down the string of symbols that actually provided the foundation for mathematics. I think the folklore goes something like, it takes to get to page 1200 something to prove that 1 + 1 = 2 by their system of axioms, right? So here's what the paper proved. 2 things. In any system of axioms strong enough to generate arithmetic of the natural numbers, that also does not produce contradictions, cannot be syntactically complete. I'll say what that is in a second. Number 2, a system of axioms cannot prove its own consistency. Okay, so there's a couple of terms we need to define here. Syntactically complete means that for each sentence phi that you can construct in the language, either phi or not phi is a theorem derivable from the axioms, right? So one way of interpreting one is that you can't necessarily assign a value of true or false to every statement. It sounds kind of a lot like, or it's approaching at least, a subjective notion of truth. Yeah. Okay, so for the second part, what does consistency mean? That just means that you can't prove that you produce no contradictions, right? So, which is actually a hypothesis of part 1, right? That we don't produce any contradictions. So, combined, these statements say if you're taking a system and trying to evaluate it, you have to construct something outside that system to evaluate whether the system is consistent or not to apply part 1 of the theorem. It's kind of a lot. But this is very much anti-formalist, right? You can't necessarily, if we even have arithmetic for natural numbers, we can't prove everything. Okay? So, let me not forget my extra comments here. So, on Hilbert's grave is written the following: we must know, we shall know. This was in reference to a bold public statement he made the day after that Gödel announced his results. He's really into formalism. He's like, this is bullshit. We're gonna know. Okay. So, oh, right. One more thing about Gödel. Remember, I said it was really sad that Cantor was in part driven to madness by his lack of ability to prove the continuum hypothesis. Well, as it turns out, Gödel's incompleteness results, combined with the work of Paul Cohen in the 1960s, actually is able to prove that the continuum hypothesis is independent of the axioms of ZFC, which is short for Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory with the axiom of choice, which is a very popular axiomatic system that represents the state of the art in formalism. And I think the working assumption is that most things that you would want to use as a classical logic have this result as well, that the continuum hypothesis is one of these statements that can't be validated or falsified. So, you know, Cantor had no hope, is what I'm trying to say. He should have let it go. Okay, so where's all the intuitionism? I haven't said a single thing about intuitionism except for what it kind of means, and I haven't said anything about what anybody has done in terms of intuitionistic logic. So what's going on? Well, I mean, think about this. The philosophy of intuitionism resists formalization, right? It says that necessarily, I think Brouwer said, you know, to try to write down a system of axioms and to capture intuitionistic reasoning is a hollow exercise. There's nothing that of mathematical benefit or philosophical benefit that will come from that. So a lot of great mathematicians working in this period that we have covered up till now, Poincaré, Borel, Le-Beg, you may know him from the integral. Poincaré, of course, had the Millennium Prize problem solved in the early 2010s, right? I think that's right. Oh, the early zeros.
By Gregory Perelman.
Gregory Perelman, yeah, thank you. And Kronecker, to name a few, right? Kronecker was this detractor of Cantor's very intuitionistic leanings, but they didn't necessarily incorporate those views explicitly into their work, right? So now we'll enter into the picture. Brouwer, the stern, pixelated man. Okay, quick bio. Born February 27th, 1881 in the Netherlands, educated at the University of Amsterdam, and one of the founders of modern topology. You may or may not be familiar with Brouwer's fixed point theorem. This just says that any continuous function on a convex compact set in a Euclidean space mapping to itself necessarily has a fixed point. And there's vast generalizations of that as well. But the important part for this talk is that he's the sole founder of the intuitionist school. He's the one person who was like, oh, we need to make this actually written down somewhere and in direct conflict, not just opposition, conflict to formalism. Okay, so here's a bit of his story. He's got a kind of a interesting contrarian story. So he had this paper titled The Untrustworthiness of the Principles of Logic, wherein he challenged the belief that the rules of classical logic, which have come down to us essentially from Aristotle, have absolute validity, independent of the subject matter to which they are applied. And this is an account written by Stephen Kleene, who was actually kind of he evened things out decades after this conflict stopped raging so much. He's like, okay, here's a couple formal systems that work for either camp, and let's actually make a coherent comparison of them. Whereas in this era, in the 20s and 30s, it's kind of all about personality and philosophy more than anything, which is weird. So when he published this paper back in 1908, right? Lots of controversy, criticism, including from his advisor. In fact, his advisor would not accept a chapter of his thesis because his advisor said this is philosophical and has nothing to do with mathematics. So this is very cunning of Brouwer. Supposedly, he made a conscious effort to suppress his intuitionist leanings until he could establish his career as a brilliant mathematician, which he did quite effectively. After all, I didn't exaggerate when I said he was a founder of modern topology. There was more than just the fixed point theorem. It worked so well, in fact, that he was able to hide his intuitionist leaning, that Hilbert himself helped Brouwer acquire a position at the University of Amsterdam in 1912. And after he had a position secured, that's it. Intuitionist all the way. Okay? So here's just a snippet of some exchanges between Brouwer and Hilbert. So Brouwer went back to a paper that Hilbert had written back in 1884, I think, something like that, proving the Hilbert basis theorem, which is a theorem of abstract algebra saying that if you have a Noetherian ring, if any polynomial ring in an arbitrary number of variables will also be Noetherian, which is some finiteness condition. So in this proof, he used the law of the excluded middle, right? He said P or not P is necessarily true over infinite sets. Okay, so Brouwer had a huge issue with this because this was he took it up as his life's work to put intuitionism on equal or higher footing than formalism. Okay, so here's what Hilbert wrote in 1927. Oh yeah, so Brouwer's criticism comes along in the late 20s, right? And Hilbert writes this: I am most astonished by the fact that even in mathematical circles, the power of suggestion of a single man, however full of temperament and inventiveness, is capable of having the most improbable and eccentric effects. Pretty harsh words for the late 1920s, at least in mathematical circles. To which Brouwer replied later that year, formalism has received nothing but benefactions from intuitionism and may expect further benefactions. The formalistic school should therefore accord some recognition to intuitionism instead of polemicizing against it in sneering tones while not even observing proper mention of authorship. Again, very harsh. Scathing. So this kind of back and forth, this swapping of barbs is typical for many years between Hilbert and Brouwer, and in fact, salt in the wound, one of Hilbert's most promising students, Hermann Weyl, actually got swayed to intuitionism so hard. He was eventually a collaborator of Einstein. Great historical work by Weyl is Space, Time, and Matter. He fell under Brouwer's spell, right? And he actually engaged in this public discourse of exchanging publications that insulted each other. So Hilbert was really sad about that. However, still to this point, there's no explicit axiomatic system or formalization of intuitionistic reasoning. Again, at odds with the philosophy of intuitionism. Some people just can't get over themselves. Okay, so we'll move on to R.M. Hiding. So this is where maybe you've heard legends of all these people that we've mentioned so far. Most likely people haven't heard of Hiding. He's been hiding. Oh, that's good. I'll incorporate that if I ever give this talk again. All right, so born May 9th in 1898 in the Netherlands, again at the University of Amsterdam. And he's known for one of the two accounts of the BHK interpretation of intuitionism, which is the algebraic formulation of intuitionism, kind of opposite of Boolean algebra, right? George Boole, a turn of the century English logician. When I say turn of the century, I mean 19th to 20th, who wrote down algebraic means to represent a system of logic that represents classical mathematics. Okay, so now we have these objects due to hiding called hiding algebras that represent intuitionistically how one might reason. This is an insane naming convention. This is the BHK interpretation. B for Brouwer, H for Hiding, K for Kolmogorov. Although I think this is because Hiding and Kolmogorov had some correspondence, and Hiding kind of like took some of the information from that and put it in his interpretation. Kolmogorov has his own interpretation that is just called Kolmogorov's interpretation. He didn't really have anything to do with what I'm about to tell you is what I'm trying to say. But that's what it's called nonetheless. Okay, so not a lot is said on the internet about Hiding. He's not one of these mega personalities. He was a student of Brouwer's, but he proposed the following, which again, this is specifically where Brouwer was like, this is a hollow exercise. You're wasting your time doing this. But because of Hiding, we actually have a formalization of intuitionistic logic. Okay, so here's some rules that Hiding wrote down for how we can use logical connectives to build more expressions in intuitionism, right? So if we have formulae P and Q, a proof of P and Q is a pair, A comma B, where A is a construction validating P and B is a construction validating Q. Here, as I've written here, I've written some places proof and other places a construction validating. Those are the same things to an intuitionist, right? I just wrote a construction validating some places to emphasize that that's what it really means to provide proof in intuitionism. You have to provide a construction of a thing that satisfies the formula. Okay, and we'll see an example of how to do that right after this. A proof of P implies Q is a function F that converts a construction validating P into a construction validating Q. Oh, looks like I have a typo here. Sorry. This symbol here the perpendicular symbol, is supposed to be here as well. Okay, call that absurdity. Absurdity is a formula with no proof. Absurdity, or the bottom type. Or if you're into automated theorem provers, this could be the symbol for non-terminating, non-ending program, something like that. Yeah. Okay, and then finally, the formula negation P is defined as P implies absurdity, meaning it has a proof. It has as a proof a function converting a proof of P into a proof of absurdity, which has no proofs, right? So it's this kind of like roundabout way of getting an intuitive definition of what we think negation should be. That I can transform any proof of P into a proof of a thing that doesn't have a proof. Okay. So, and there's more rules here for the connective or and for the quantifiers. Okay. So, right. Let's see how we can actually use this to prove something. Yes.
So what I'm taking away from that is the only valid proof is a proof by construction.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Yes.
And does part 4 over there on the slides bring back proof by contradiction? No.
No, it does not, and it's constructed precisely so that it doesn't.
Okay.
Yeah, that's why we go in this roundabout way, and that's something that you can deduce from the full set of interpretations that Heiding provides. Okay, so right. So as we said before at the very beginning, that intuitionists insist that P and negation P not be true, right? That is to say, there is no construction validating this formula. Well, let's see if we can use those first 4 rules I gave you to try to deduce this. Okay, so by the interpretation of part 4, right, we know that the negation of P and negation P is interpreted as the P and P implies absurdity, and the proof of this statement is a function converting a proof of what we have in parentheses here into a proof of absurdity. Let's say that proof of absurdity is F. Okay, and then we want to know what a proof of P and P implies absurdity is. It's a pair A comma B, where A is a proof of P, and B is a function that takes a proof of P and gives back a proof of absurdity. Right? I'm just unpacking the according to the interpretations that Heiding did. Okay, so we can indeed construct such a function, right? That is to say, we want to take a function F and evaluate a proof of P and P implies absurdity, A comma B. Well, all we do is say, okay, for input A comma B, we evaluate B at A. That is to say, we constructed a proof of absurdity from the premise P and P implies absurdity, regardless of the particular formula P. The actual content of P has nothing to do with the manipulation that we did, right? So intuitionistically, we have our principle of non-contradiction. Okay. So, let me check. Did I forget to say anything? Nothing that I can say at the end. All right, so our last major figure before we actually, I'm doing pretty well on time actually. Our last major figure before we talk about, maybe I'll just say a couple words about where intuitionism has kind of made a comeback. Andrei Kolmogorov. So born April 25th, 1903 in the Russian Empire, Moscow State University is a school known for everything, really. Kolmogorov worked in everything. I have a list written here separately. I didn't want to make the slide too cluttered. Let's see, he was the founder of formal probability. He did major work in topology, analysis, turbulence, mechanics, Complexity, that's where you most likely have heard of him before. Kolmogorov complexity. The Kolmogorov complexity of a program is the shortest expression you can write it in a predetermined language, right? Dynamics, PDEs, it did it all, including another interpretation of intuitionism. And in fact, he only wrote 2 papers in his career on logic, and they were right at the beginning of his career, really. On the principle of the excluded middle, probably guess what that's about, and something else in German. So what he did in his first paper from 25 was he went back to a set of classical axioms proposed by Hilbert, only involving negation and implication, with using only the rule of inference, modus ponens, that Hilbert had tried to found formalism on. And he made some modifications, right? He took a couple of Hilbert's axioms, there were 6 of them, and discarded them and replaced them with something that made an intuitionistic definition of negation, right? So this actually becomes really complicated really quickly, which is a testament to what a polymath Kolmogorov was. This is one of the first things he ever published, and it's groundbreaking in the field of determining what's possible intuitionistically. So here's the real rub here of what Kolmogorov was able to do. Classical mathematics can be seen as a fragment of intuitionistic mathematics, using only the connectors and implication and negation and the quantifier for all, with Kolmogorov's modifications. Okay, so really. Okay, so Gödel, go back. Gödel kind of debunked the whole idea that formalism could achieve as much as Hilbert claimed. And we finally get to some coherent formal description of what intuitionism is. And then very shortly thereafter, Kolmogorov is like, oh, actually, you guys shouldn't have been arguing. This is not something that is, these are not mutually incompatible, I guess is the thing to say here. So I learned most of this from this article by Thierry Coquand, Kolmogorov's Contributions to Intuitionistic Logic, which is in this larger volume, Kolmogorov's Heritage in Mathematics, which just has everything that he ever did. It's just a compendium of like short, semi-technical papers by other mathematicians or computer scientists talking about everything he did. Really great book, free online, maybe check it out. Okay, so I think we can all agree, formalism won, right? Probably most of you had not really heard much about intuitionism before today. Maybe I'm being a bit presumptuous then. But definitely we're trained as mathematicians to use the precepts of formalism, right? We are not told to take special care of what type of set we're quantifying over when we learn about quantifiers, right? We're not afforded the opportunity to even think about the philosophical ramifications of using the law of the excluded middle, right? That era is gone by. But why did formalism win? I mean, Gödel basically debunked it, right? I mean, well, he debunked the highest aspirations of it. I mean, the easiest and most depressing answer is that, well, it's easiest to think about, or rather not think about, the technical details of what logical connectors you use and what that means for the underlying structures that you're trying to manipulate. Maybe it's just too unsatisfying for the average mathematician to face day by day. Maybe that was what was decided all those decades ago. But the good news is that there's certain places where intuitionism is kind of breaking through again into popular mathematics. Well, that's good news to me, at least. The logic used by any proof assistant, such as ACTA, Coq, or L.E.J, we were talking about right beforehand, this is all intuitionistic at its core, right? there's nothing classical about it really, other than Paul McGarrow's result that you can cover classical mathematics as a fragment of intuitionism. Also, this thing that's really popular these days, or at least was last decade, this thing that was spearheaded by Vladimir Voevodsky, using the homotopy data of topological spaces to generate type theories. Right? This is homotopy type theory. I don't know. This was like a really huge buzzword like 10 years ago. I think it's kind of faded, but maybe you've heard this before. And then there's a personal favorite of mine, the recasting of differential geometry into a setting where limits can be dispensed with. This is synthetic differential geometry. So I have to admit, I gave you this list of 3 things here. Secretly, these are all have the same underlying framework, that of topos theory. Right? So this the generation of topos theory starts at about the 1940s and goes through the 60s. So that would be the beginning of the second half of this talk about the history of intuitionism. But for now, I think I said enough. So we can all go now.
We have time for questions.
I'm gonna eat while you ask.
Yeah. So, any questions?
Yeah, so with the very last thing you mentioned, toposes or however you say it, that was kind of like broke the extinct, right? So how did that relate to all of his work on algebraic geometry?
That's a great question. So the genesis of topos theory happened simultaneously from 2 different directions. One was Grothendieck in algebraic geometry, and the other one was F. William Levier, who worked in logic and physics. He was trying to come up with a categorical formulation of mechanics, and then stumbled upon this interpretation of taking sets as propositions and functions as proofs, functions between them as proofs, and recognizing that the type of category that he was trying to construct to capture mechanics also had an interface with this way of seeing propositions and proofs. Grothendieck, on the other hand, his insight was so he started in algebraic geometry, right? Where you look at a locus of points in space that is defined by a set of polynomials, common zeros of a finite set of polynomials. So what he did was, instead of just considering those geometrical objects, started to look at the functions, the algebraic morphisms that had those geometric objects as domains or codomains. I kind of forget which one is which, or not which one is which, but which one he used. And from there, it's not so hard a leap to start talking about sheaves on these geometric spaces defined by algebraic equations. So when you look at these categories of sheaves, satisfy the same set of axioms that Levier came up with. That's what a topos is. Yeah, and so any category which satisfies these axioms has an internal language that is by default intuitionistic. And that's where all 3 of those examples basically come from, but from very different perspectives.
More of a general questions, but so like, thinking back about like, classical sort of like logic, set theory, that sort of thing, it seems like, or at least from sort of our perspective now, looking back, they were, I'm gonna use the word formalizing, but not in the sense of formalization, but the formalizing sort of things in logic for the sake of formalizing things in logic. Whereas, now it almost seems like, or I guess I'll pose another question. Is there still sort of that with modern logic now, or is it mostly now just applying sort of the tools that have been sort of over the last century or two to new things?
Well, I don't know if this is an answer to your question, but I think the average mathematician is quite divorced from philosophy these days. The closest branch of mathematics to philosophy is logic. So then the question becomes, what's the new logic being generated? I have a biased answer to that. It's mainly categorical. Yeah.
You said that like formalism was covered as a fragment by intuitionism. I'm not sure if I'm like misinterpreting, but does that mean that you can prove the same things or more things with an intuitionist framework as formalism?
Yeah, that's right. So you can recover everything that you get in classical mathematics in intuitionistic mathematics. Is the fascinating result that Brouwer came up. Yeah, it's not obvious at all that you can do that because you're taking away so much, right? Yeah. I think it was next.
Oh, this is a bit of a new question, but do you have any like personal conjectures about like how we should interpret logic or about like what a proper system we should use?
Differently every time. And I mean that in all seriousness. It's kind of funny to say, but I think we should learn from the conclusion of that era. It was like too much people getting obsessed with one thing, right? Putting too much stock into one type of model or type of philosophy of what the true nature of mathematics is. So I guess what I'm saying at its core is kind of an intuitionistic thing. It's a meta-intuitionistic thing, right? You should search for the model which fits what you intuit your observations in mathematics around you are happening. I think that's my answer.
So should the problem you're trying to solve motivate the act of mathematics that you use?
Yeah, I think that's more or less.
My understanding that in the proof systems like contract, type checking is a decidable procedure. So there's like an algorithm that can read the term and in finite time say yes or no, whether like the proof object is like valid or invalid. But I know that there's like another system called neutral. Have you heard of it?
I don't know that one, no.
So that one, instead of having a type checker, you like their system is like types undecidable. Like so what happens? So in like the traditional form of type checking, is there a limitation which like you can't express arbitrary proof steps to show that a certain thing is well typed. It goes to like something like extensional, but it's intentionally.
Oh, yeah, okay. I've only barely heard of any of that. I actually don't know the least of anything that we talked about today about the group assistance and things like Copper Acta. What was the one that you mentioned?
Neutral, NUPRL.
New Pearl. Okay. Yeah, I don't know. That's I'm unfortunately I have no coherent thing to say about that.
Have you heard of like the difference between like extensional and intentional equality?
Yes, but again, I couldn't really tell you anything about it off the top of my head. Sorry. Oh, is that where it's from?
No, but that would be funny if it was.
Okay.
Yeah, I think Sam estimating about proof of contradiction, how it throws out like half of computer science. So like in like the instance of computer sciences, things are binary. In that circumstance, when you then return, say like formalism is a good system to adopt.
Well, yeah, I think a lot of the results of computer science are useful enough to consider valid for as long as they work for you. Which in fact, in turn, I think is kind of a very computer science type of attitude to have, right? As long as it works, keep using it. But yeah, that's a good question. Are there new and useful consequences that you could derive in computer science by discarding that half and trying to rebuild things intuitionistically? That's a great question. I don't really know the answer. Yeah.
kind of like going back to the topos theory stuff, like, could you say something about like broadest universes? I've just heard the word, don't barely know what they are, but does that relate to the foundation stuff? And have people thought about that since?
Yeah, so my understanding is Grothendieck universes are basically constructions that help you circumvent certain paradoxes when you start talking about cardinalities that exceed some certain other cardinality. I think some keywords, maybe you want to look up inaccessible cardinals. I mean, I guess, again, this is way out of my expertise, but
Is that some issue with like the size of your category that you're working in being like way too big or something?
yeah. So it's this proper class issue that you encounter in basic category theory. First, there's this book. Oh, here's what you should look at. I think there's this book from the 80s called Algebraic Set Theory by Gonzalo Reyes and Diek Mordic. It's like this thin, but it's extremely dense, and it has an alternative way of dealing with those that problem of going to higher and higher cardinalities. It could be interesting, but again, I don't know. I'm not totally certain of the relationship with growth, but there's something in there. I think. Yeah.
You consider yourself an intuitionist?
Yeah, I think so. Most of the time.
He admits it.
I thought I admitted that a few times during the talk.
Yeah, but.
Yeah.
Any recommended resources that I can use to further my my budding heretical beliefs?
Yeah, I don't think I should say though. I don't want to be. I don't want to be persecuted. Yes.
Well, first of all, thank you for a wonderful talk. That was really great.
Oh, no.
As somebody who's not a professional mathematician, I think you did a really fantastic job taking us through that history. So I kind of have more of a bird's eye view question for you. You took us through, the history of these kind of warring factions, and you gave us a glimpse about kind of the recent present. What do you see in terms of the future? Is this something that's gaining momentum? Is this something that's still very obscure? Like, what does your crystal ball tell you?
Well, I definitely think both of those. It is gaining momentum, and it's still extremely obscure. Here's what I would like to happen. I would like to have category theory as a fundamental starting point for the education in mathematics, in higher mathematics. I think that would increase the momentum quite a lot for something that I think is of increasing usefulness in generating new mathematics or even practical mathematics, right? There are these new type checkers, these proof assistants coming out all the time. So yeah, I think that alone is generating enough interest to keep the momentum growing. But I would like to see it happen even faster. Yeah.
So if we think about like levels of abstraction within mathematics, it's typically thought of as set theory being like the last layer of abstraction, and there's like an increasing push for like theorem provers to like go even a layer beneath that. So how does with something like category play into that? Would that be like the greatest level of abstraction?
That's hard to say. I think that gets into like, you have to start then thinking about like, what precisely do you mean by abstraction? Right?
I guess like the axioms from which like the rest of math is built on, like you can think of like sets as like abstract numbers, for example.
Right. So here's my answer to that. After preparing this talk, I have a serious aversion to trying to find the bottom or descend a level. Rather, I think it's more important to accept new constructions where they're useful and see where they interface, rather than determining if there's a hierarchy. Not to say it's wrong to try, but personally, that feels less desirable to me.
At all? Cool. I think that's all we have time for. So everyone give another round of applause. All right. Very much. So we have plenty of pizza here. If anyone would like some, help yourselves. Besides that, they're probably gonna shut off the lights in like an hour. You don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. And obviously that meeting next week. Yes, no meeting next week.
No.